Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. On a grey morning in late October, I, Dr. John H. Watson, found myself sat opposite Sherlock Holmes in the old sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Outside, a light drizzle left sparkling streaks on the window panes, distorting the shape of the gas lamps and sending a delicate chill through the hearth-warmed room. Holmes was in one of his more meditative moods, lying in his armchair in a cloud of Turkish tobacco, his long fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze drifting to some distant mental theatre. I had just returned from Paddington, where I had seen off one of my patients to the West Country. I had anticipated for a calm morning, possibly even a game of backgammon, but Holmes's stillness suggested otherwise. He hadn't spoken since I arrived, and as the minutes passed, I finally turned to break the spell. "You seem preoccupied, Holmes." His grey eyes gave me a fleeting glimmer of amusement. "Only mildly so, Watson. I was just calculating the precise weight of the boot polish your new patient left on our carpet. Based on the angle and pressure of his stride, he is either favouring his left leg or concealing a hip wound." I laughed. "It is always reassuring to know your mind has lost none of its peculiar edge." A sudden knock on the door interrupted Holmes's response. Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice continued, "A gentleman to see Mr. Holmes." We both looked up when a curious figure entered the room a few moments later. He was in his early 50s, clad in a well-pressed dark green overcoat with silver toggles that shone slightly in the lamplight. His hat was of a regional style, not particularly trendy in London, and his boots, Holmes would undoubtedly comment on them soon, were faintly caked with pale clay. But the object in his hands drew our attention. Birthday cake. It was a simple object, spherical and plainly frosted, with 7 little blue candles nestled into the top. The subtle aroma of vanilla and almond accompanied the man inside the room. He appeared uncomfortable holding it, as if he hadn't intended to arrive with it still in his possession. "Mr. Holmes," he replied, his voice low and weary. "My name is Harold Lavington. I was told to come see you. They said if anyone could make sense of what I've seen, it would be you." Holmes arose slowly. "Please, Mr. Lavington, set the cake down. I do not believe we need refreshments yet." Lavington chuckled, faintly, tinged with unease. He set the cake on the tiny table opposite Holmes's violin bag and sat heavily in the chair I offered. "It's not in jest," he said hastily. "The cake, I mean. I realize that seems crazy, but I swear to you, something is very wrong." Holmes slumped back into his chair, his eyes sharply focused. "Begin from the beginning, Mr. Lavington, and leave out nothing, whatever minor it may appear." The man nodded. "I am a steward, sir. I've been doing this for about 2 decades. I run Lord Milbray's estate in Northumberland. He's a kind employer. Distant, but fair." "Aged," Holmes interjected. "He is 62 years old, but his health has deteriorated during the last 3 years. Heart problems. His doctor, Dr. Ramsay, now sees him twice a week." "And the cake?" Holmes inquired gently. Lavington leaned forwards. "That's it. Lord Milbray's birthday occurs in June. Always has been. But 2 nights ago, someone placed this on the manor's front steps. No name, no card. Just this cake, beautifully packaged in white paper. It had 7 blue candles in it, all unlit. Nobody had came to the door. The staff had been indoors all evening. And yet, when the maid found it, it was fresh and warm." Watson and I exchanged eyes. Meanwhile, Holmes was looking at the cake with much interest. "It would be unusual enough," Lavington went on, "if not for what happened the next day. Lord Milbray fell at breakfast. There's no warning. There is no exertion. Just down he went. He is alive, thank God, but unconscious. Dr. Ramsay cannot explain it. He claims it's not his heart." Holmes's fingers tapped across the armrest. "And the household?" "Agitated. I'm scared, to be honest. This is not the first strange incident this week. 3 nights ago, the library was found unlocked at daylight, despite the fact that Lord Milbray routinely locks it before retiring. Window had been unlatched, but nothing was stolen. A week before that, one of the horses was discovered dead in its stable. Again, no wounds, no illness prior. Watson said quietly, "You suspect someone means harm to Lord Milbray?" Lavington looked down. "I'm not sure what I suspect, Doctor. However, someone left a birthday cake for a man who had his birthday 4 months ago, and he is now on the verge of death. That strikes me as more than a coincidence." Holmes rose and approached the cake. He circled it cautiously, analyzing its surface with such focus that I wondered if he could read it like a written page. "Who had access to the front of the house?" "That night?" "No one, sir. We were all indoors. I made sure the gates were secured at sunset, and the footman swears he checked them before bed." "No recent guests?" "Only Miss Carroway. She is Lord Milbray's niece. I came up from London 2 weeks ago. She looks after him most evenings." "Close with her uncle?" Lavington paused. "They used to be, but recently I've heard raised voices. She wants him to change his mind." Holmes arched his brow. "Ah," Lavington shakes his head. "But she would not do this. She's impulsive, definitely, but not cruel." Holmes turned away from the cake. "All details, Mr. Lavington. Did anything accompany the cake?" "A note or a symbol. Nothing but a folded napkin beneath the box. I brought it as well." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a square of soft linen, which Holmes carefully held in gloved fingers. There, faint but clear, was a small embroidered motif in pale blue thread, 7 candles grouped in a circle, their wicks shaped. "Like an eye." Holmes expelled a quick breath. "Curious. Very curious." He straightened. "Mr. Lavington, I'll accompany you to Northumberland on the 10:15 express tomorrow. Please leave the cake alone and keep your visit to Baker Street a secret from everyone, including Miss Carroway herself. I feel we're dealing with something much more purposeful than superstition." Lavington appeared relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I'm not sure what we're up against, but knowing you're involved makes me feel better already." As he made his leave, the aroma of almond and vanilla lingered slightly behind him. Holmes stood motionless for several minutes, his gaze concentrated not on the cake but on the napkin, which was now lying flat on the desk. "Watson," he inquired calmly, "do you recall the Candlemark manuscript incident?" I frowned. "Only vaguely. A forged codex and an apothecary in Kent, if memory serves." "Precisely. The emblem on this fabric has occurred before, in the margins of a page mistakenly claimed to the 14th century. It was dismissed as imaginative embroidery, but I start to suspect—" He did not complete the thought. Instead, he moved to the fire and drew the curtain close. Whatever was ahead in Northumberland, it would not be a simple matter of cake and candles. The following morning was clear and cold, with the London fog briefly lifting to expose a pale blue sky dotted with high wisps of cloud. When I descended the stairs, Holmes was already clothed and seated at the breakfast table, his plate untouched save for a single egg, which he had dismantled with forensic care but made no move to devour. "I trust your bag is packed, Watson," he continued, not looking up from the paper he had folded twice lengthwise, his gaze scanning the columns without fully reading them. I poured myself a cup of coffee. "It is. Though I confess I'm still fighting with the concept that a cake, however bizarrely timed, could be anything more than a peculiar prank." Holmes eventually dropped the page, his expression sharpened with something more than ordinary curiosity. "When an object is picked for its banality, Watson, it is frequently the case that it requires the most inspection. A pistol on a man's bedside raises suspicions. But a birthday cake on the doorstep," he taps the paper, "that is the mark of someone who understands appearances and how to use them to cloak intent." The journey to Northumberland was uneventful, with Holmes remaining mostly silent. I could see his mind ticking behind his grey eyes as he processed the facts with that never-ending engine of deduction he carried within him. He said something to himself about 7 flames and the eye turned inward once. But he didn't clarify, and I didn't press him. We arrived at Milbray Manor as the sun was setting, leaving long golden streaks across the moorland. The house was a lovely old edifice, Victorian Gothic in style, with tiny windows and a central tower that gave the sensation of watching one's approach. A single puff of smoke curled from a side chimney, but the building appeared as motionless as the stones around it. Harold Lavington greeted us at the door, exuding the same apprehensive intensity, albeit bolstered by our presence. "Dr. Ramsay is with Lord Milbray now," he added as he led us through the lobby. "You're still unconscious. There has been no change in his condition since my visit to you." "And the cake?" Holmes inquired. "In the pantry, untouched, as directed. The napkin is locked in my drawer." "Good." As we proceeded through the house, I took silent notes on the ambience. The workers moved slowly, their voices quiet, their gazes drawn to the locked doors. Something clung to the manor, a sensation of dread rather than regret. The air itself seemed to hold a quiet that one would identify with a cathedral rather than a home. Holmes turned to face Lavington. "And Miss Carroway?" "She is upstairs. I merely told her that we were expecting visitors. Introduce us as Lord Milbrays, friends who are travelling from London to support his rehabilitation. Don't mention my occupation or name just yet." Miss Edith Carroway was seated in the upper drawing-room, near the large windows overlooking the autumn-coloured lawns. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe no older than 30, with pale features, intelligent blue eyes, and a tightness in her stance that suggested either tremendous self-possession or deep discomfort. "Miss Carroway," Lavington announced, nodding. "May I introduce Mr. Mycroft and Dr. Whodunit?" Holmes showed no amusement at the claimed name, but I did notice a slight flash of interest in the young woman's eyes. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," Holmes remarked with a bow. "Mr. Lavington tells us that your uncle is most unwell." "He is," she answered gently. "He hasn't opened his eyes since Tuesday. It's very unlike him." "May I ask, has he suffered anything similar in the past?" "Fainting spells occur occasionally, but not of this magnitude. His heart is frail, undoubtedly, but he was conscious just the night before. We had a disagreement. And then the next morning—" Her voice died off, and I wondered if she was going to cry, but she didn't. Instead, she rose and approached the window. "You're friends of his?" "Distant ones," Holmes answered. "More interested in peculiar circumstances than bloodlines." That caught her gaze. "Then I imagine Harold told you about the cake." "Yes, he did, and the timing seems intentional." Her expression became unreadable. "You think someone's trying to harm my uncle?" Before responding, Holmes took her into careful consideration. "Let us say I find the details sufficiently irregular to warrant examination." "Good," she said sternly, "because no one here appears inclined to believe it. Not the doctor, not the E.E. staff. But I do know my uncle, and I know there's something wrong." There was a gap before she turned and left. "I hope you find the answers, Mr. Mycroft. If you would forgive me, I promised to sit with him before supper." After she had left, I turned to Holmes. "Do you believe her?" "She's bright," he said, "and either telling the truth or a very talented actress. Both options deserve our attention." We descended to the kitchen, where Lavington produced the cake from the pantry, with the same cautious reverence one might save for an explosive shell. Holmes avoided making immediate contact with it. He used tweezers to take a single sliver of the icing and placed it in a little glass vial. "Almond," I replied. "Strong scent." "Not just almond, Watson. Bitter almond." He smelled the cake and then studied it with a little magnifying glass. "There is a light dusting here toward the base, possibly powdered stone fruit kernel, albeit not enough to be fatal. And yet, it wasn't supposed to be eaten, right?" "No one has," I reassured him. "Precisely. The threat is not ingestion, but symbolism. 7 candles are unlit, bitter almond, a napkin with an all-seeing eye made of flames. Watson, this is theatre, a performance for someone paying close attention. And the audience?" Holmes straightened. "I suspect we are not the intended viewers, but we've been granted access nonetheless." That night, we were led to modest guest accommodations at the east end of the house. Holmes scarcely rested. Around midnight, I caught him sketching the design from the embroidered napkin with a candlelight, muttering under his breath. When I inquired what bothered him, he simply responded, "A sign older than The manor itself, but reused, repurposed. The next morning, Holmes requested a private walk around the manor grounds, which Lavington, though perplexed, granted. As we walked around the back garden and neared the ancient carriage house, Holmes paused abruptly. "Observe the stonework there," he said, pointing. "See the archway? There's a stone above it, half buried beneath lichen." I squinted and spotted it, a carved relief, virtually smoothed but identifiable once you know what you're looking for. 7 candles were put in a circle. "The same motif," I whispered. "Older than embroidery, older than cakes. Watson, I suppose." This house was chosen not just as a residence but also as a theatre. The act may have started today, but the stage was set long before. A small clang behind us prompted us both to turn abruptly. A figure hurried from the path we had just taken, short, bent, and going at an unusually fast pace. Holmes gave chase right away, and I followed closely behind. The person ran into the side hedge labyrinth, barely tall enough to hide the head, and vanished. When we emerged in the center, the clearing was vacant, but laying on the grass was another napkin, identical to the first save for one critical change. Just 6 candles. One of them was burning, not stitched, but real, drawn with soot, as if from the tip of a burned match. Holmes held it up with careful care, his face unreadable. "Now, Watson," he muttered, "the clock has begun." And he turned, startling me, and walked back toward the manor with purpose. Whatever game was being played here, Holmes had accepted his place in it, and I, as usual, followed. By the time we returned to the mansion with the soot-stained napkin, the sky had darkened to a bleak slate, and the air was thick with the aroma of damp ground and fallen leaves. Holmes went rapidly, his pace precise, but his mind was plainly racing ahead of him. He said nothing until we got to the study, where he placed the second napkin next to the first on the writing desk and inspected it under the light of a gas lamp. "There is no mistake," he added, speaking to himself rather than to me. "The first image depicts 7 unlit candles placed in a perfect eye. This one has 6 unlit candles and 1 lit candle. However, the drawing was rudimentary, improvised. Soot from a struck match, a message, albeit not a subtle one." I leaned closer and studied the lines. "A countdown?" Holmes looked up at me, his expression grim. "Yes, Watson. I assume someone has started a sequence, with each flame symbolizing a step, a warning, or possibly a toll. The fact that this one burned indicates that the first act is complete. Do you think this was left for us? After we left the cake untouched?" "I think," he said slowly, "that it was left for someone to watch, perhaps Miss Carroway. Perhaps it was someone else, but we intercepted it. That may influence the tempo of events." A knock at the study door interrupted my reply. Lavington entered, his forehead furrowed with tension. "Pardon the interruption, but Dr. Ramsay has requested to talk with you." "Yes, both of you. He's in the east corridor, right outside Lord Milbray's room." We swiftly followed Lavington down the hall, past heavy velvet draperies and ancient paintings that appeared to glower at our presence. The house had become even quieter, the kind of hush that surrounds a distressed household. Dr. Ramsay waited for us at a carved wood door, hands folded in front of him. He was a trim man in his early 60s, with a doctor's cautious countenance, and the clipped words of someone used to authority. "I was told you were family friends," he said abruptly. "I must say your timing is interesting, and your unexpected arrival is really unusual." Holmes bowed slightly. "Forgive the informality. Mr. Lavington asked us to discuss an urgent problem. We mean no offense, simply assistance." Dr. Ramsay's lips squeezed together, creating a line of minor irritation. "I have done all I can for Lord Milbray. His collapse is not cardiac in nature, that much is certain. I've tested for poisons, arsenic, digitalis, even laudanum. It's all negative. His respiration is shallow but steady. His pulse is faint but regular. He is unreachable but not dead." Holmes tilted his head. "A weird state, not unconscious and not poisoned, as if thrown in an unnatural sleep." Ramsay frowned. "There are neurological conditions that can result in catatonia, but none explain the suddenness of his collapse, nor the absence of any preceding symptoms." "May I see him?" Holmes inquired. Ramsay reluctantly opened the door. The room beyond was dimly lighted, with only a lamp on the bedside. Lord Milbrae lay motionless under a wool blanket, his face wan and slack. He was breathing, but only just. Each rise and fall of his chest was shallow and mechanical, as if performed out of habit rather than life. Holmes proceeded cautiously, evaluating the man not as a physician, but as a scientist, studying the consequences of a mechanism. He raised Milbrae's right hand, gently rotated it and let it fall back onto the coverlet. Holmes mumbled, "He looks like he's drained. Not physically, but volitionally. As if the machinery of his will had been tampered with." Dr. Ramsay bristled. "Pardon me, but that sounds more metaphysical than medical." "Quite so," Holmes replied unconcerned. "But the metaphysical, when weaponized, can sometimes produce the most physical of consequences." Holmes then turned towards the windows. They were carefully secured, and the curtains were drawn. He examined the floorboards, ran his palm down the stone windowsill, and paused at a little wooden writing desk in the corner. "This was moved recently," he added, gesturing. "See the scuff marks?" Dr. Ramsay gave a glance. "Possibly. The maid may have cleaned beneath it." Holmes opened the desk drawer and extracted a stack of folded letters, bound with a green ribbon. He did not open them, instead examining the paper, its watermark, and the way the ribbon had been retied. These were read recently. "And not by Lord Milbrae." Ramsay said nothing. Holmes reinserted the letters precisely and closed the drawer. "Thanks for your time, Doctor. I will not disturb the patient any further." As we exited the room, Holmes hesitated outside the door and glanced down the corridor. "There are movements in this house," he explained quietly. "Not malevolent in appearance, but methodical. Someone wants Lord Milbrae incapacitated, not killed. This makes him more effective in silence than in speech. What do you suppose is in those letters? Something the perpetrator is afraid he will share. A secret, Watson. Possibly one that links all of this, the cake, the napkins, the countdown. We must find out what Lord Milbrae knew." Back in the study, Holmes resumed his position at the desk and removed a notebook from his coat. He drew both napkins again, this time altering the angles of the flames and their orientation. He turned the drawings clockwise, then upside down, as though trying to make them speak. "There is pattern here," he said. "Symbolic but practical. A language meant to signal steps. The first candle was left unlit. Now one is marked as burned. 6 remain, but what do they mark time toward?" Before I could offer a theory, Lavington entered again, more breathless. This time, "Mr. Holmes, you asked me to inform you of any changes." "Yes, there's been another one." Holmes stood at once. "Another napkin?" "No. Something worse. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, has vanished." "Vanished?" "Her quarters were empty this morning, her bed untouched. No one has seen her since late last night. Her keys are missing from the hook, and the servant's stairwell was found unlocked." Holmes turned sharply, retrieving his coat. "Search the grounds. Start with the north hedge and the well house. If she has been taken or frightened into fleeing, we must know which." "What shall I tell the others?" Lavington asked. "Nothing yet," Holmes said. "Keep order, appear calm. But if this is the second step, then we are already behind." As Lavington left to raise a discreet search, Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. "This is not the work of a madman, Watson. This is a rehearsal, a ritual. Each act prepared in advance, each move calculated to unsettle rather than destroy. But someone is tightening the circle. 7 candles. 1 man falls. Now a woman disappears. And what happens when the 7th candle is lit?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his pipe and lit it slowly, staring through the curling smoke at the space between the 2 napkins. "I fear," he said, "that this house has a history no one wants to remember, but it has remembered itself, and someone is following the script." He took a long breath. "Before this day ends, Watson, we must find out who wrote it." The search for Mrs. Fenwick began with the discretion Holmes had insisted upon, though unease had already begun to thread its way into the manor's corridors. Holmes and I descended the narrow servants' staircase, our boots echoing lightly along the stone steps as we entered the lower wing. The air was colder here, untouched by the hearths above. Holmes moved swiftly through the laundry room, the scullery, and the pantry, observing with a quiet, surgical attention that seemed to note even the subtle displacement of a mop or the faint drag mark on a tiled floor. He stopped before a side door that led to the exterior path curving toward the hedge maze. The bolt was drawn back. She left willingly, Holmes murmured, or was led out without force. I bent to examine the threshold. There are no signs of struggle. No, but look at the mud here, fresh from the moor path. And see, 2 different depths. She walked out, but someone larger followed. We stepped into the chill morning, the sky blanketed by a low, sullen mist. Holmes led the way along the hedgerow path until we reached the fork leading toward the well house. A thread of dark cloth clung to the lower thorn of a nearby hedge. Holmes plucked it free. Wool, midnight blue. The housekeeper wore a navy shawl yesterday evening. We followed the narrow path until it widened slightly before the well house, an aged stone structure roofed with slate and long disused. Holmes crouched near the door, examining the iron handle, and then turned to the moss-damp ground. Watson. I stepped forward. In the earth just before the threshold were footprints, 2 sets again. One small, narrow, pressed lightly, the other deeper, more urgent, the heels digging in as though in pursuit. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small length of twine and a measuring stick. He marked the depth and span of each print with efficiency, murmuring to himself, "A woman followed by a man, perhaps taller, certainly heavier. But see here, only the smaller prints re-emerge from the structure." "She went in," I said, slowly. "But the one who followed her did not." Holmes rose, his eyes narrowed. "Or he left another way." "Come." He pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the well house was dark and close. A single window filtered in the weak grey light. In the center stood the old stone well, capped by a rotted wooden cover, with rusted remnants of a crank and rope hanging limply above. Dust coated most surfaces, but not all. Holmes stepped forward and pointed to the windowsill. A second napkin lay there, this one partially torn and dusted with ash. 6 candles again, but now 2 were marked with soot. "This is not a warning," Holmes said. "It is a ritual, and it is accelerating." I turned toward the well. The wooden cover had been disturbed, scratches along the edge as though recently shifted. Holmes noticed too, and without waiting, he stepped forward and removed the cover. The space beneath yawned black and deep, but no foul smell emerged. No body, no dreadful conformation. Instead, a length of twine had been knotted and anchored. Inside, leading down into the gloom, Holmes fetched a lantern from a wall hook and lit it with a match. Then, without hesitation, he began descending. "Holmes," I cried, "you can't be serious." But he was already gone, his lean frame swallowed by the stone shaft. I hesitated only a moment before following. The descent was slow and damp, the lantern swinging lightly from my shoulder as I lowered myself by the rope. At last, my boots touched sodden stone, and Holmes' voice echoed faintly from a few yards away. "This was used recently," he called. "Someone has been storing things down here." I moved toward the glow of his lantern, and together we stood in a small circular chamber at the base of the well. Crates lined one wall, old, dust-covered, save for one, recently opened. Inside were several folded napkins, all identical in design to the ones we had found, and a half-empty bottle of ink. Holmes picked up a small ledger from the crate, flipping through its dampened pages. Blank except for the last 3 entries. Ignis unus, then Fenwick, then K pars secunda completa. Latin, yes. First flame, Fenwick. Second part complete. He turned slowly to me. "The victim has not been killed. She has been counted as part of something staged, something serialized." Holmes closed the ledger. "Let us return. This well isn't just an old ruin. It is a storage room, possibly even a rehearsal space." We climbed out in silence, and when we emerged, the wind had started to ruffle the leaves, causing rustling waves across the grass. Back at the estate, a mild panic had begun to develop among the employees. Despite Lavington's attempts, rumors about Mrs. Fenwick's disappearance spread. Miss Carroway greeted us in the lower hall, her face pallid yet composed. "I heard," she said. "The housekeeper. And the symbol again." Holmes examined her attentively. "Miss Carroway, please tell me frankly, what do you fear?" She took a deep breath and glanced behind her before moving closer. "There's a tale associated with this house. It's actually just old chatter. Something passed down via generations of the estate's employees. A tale of 7 flames, 7 misdeeds, and an old reckoning. When I was a child, the maids would mutter about it after dark. They claimed that long ago, one of our ancestors performed rites, ceremonies, in the lower cellar. The story was always hazy, but it finished with a warning that if the 7 fires reappeared, the family line would be severed forever. Rites? Holmes inquired sternly. What sort? Nobody knew. It was dubbed the Vigil of the Candles. The 7th was supposed to be the last verdict, but I always imagined it was just a children's story. I never imagined until a stranger left a cake on the doorstep with 7 candles, Holmes remembered. She looked at him shocked. You think this is connected to that story? I think, Holmes replied, that someone is using it. I'm not sure if they believe in the legend or just see it as a convenient framework, but they are following the regulations, and those rules are enforced. There was a prolonged hush. Holmes turned back to the study. I need to review the family records. Something from the past, real or imagined, inspired this pattern. Miss Carroway hesitated. There are old estate ledgers in the tower room. Few people go there anymore. I can take you, he nodded. Do so at once. As she left to get the keys, Holmes turned to me, his voice low. She's holding something back, Watson. Not out of malice, but possibly due to guilt. Or fear. I cast a glance toward the stairway. And if we reach the 5th flame before the truth emerges, Holmes gave me a grim look. So we won't be solving a mystery. We will attend the closing act. Miss Carroway returned 10 minutes later, holding a ring of iron keys and displaying a tautness in her features that suggested more than fatigue. Without saying anything, she led us up the main staircase past the gallery of family pictures, whose eyes appeared to follow our every move, and onto a narrower flight of stone steps that wrapped into the center tower. The air grew cooler with each ascent, and the dust denser, as if no one had been up here in months, if not years. At the top, she unlocked a large oak door with a moan of iron hinges, showing a circular chamber ringed by cabinets, wooden chests, and a vast center desk, half covered in fading ledgers and curling paperwork. Cobwebs laced the rafters, and the aroma of old parchment and time-soaked lumber lingered to the chamber. This is what remains of the family archive, she replied gently. The earlier papers dating back to before 1800 are mostly lost or crumbled, but there might be something here. Holmes stepped inside at once and began surveying the stacks with focused urgency, his long fingers trailing across bindings as if trying to summon their contents by touch alone. I joined him in quiet, and we started going through yellowed paperwork, handwritten inventory, and family communications. Watson, Holmes said softly, taking a frail, leather-bound diary from beneath a pile. Here, look at the seal. I leaned over. The inside cover bore a faded wax imprint of an eye, encircled by 7 rays or flames, which was definitely identical to the napkin theme. A scratched note in old ink beneath it read, "Of the vigil and the binding of the line." Holmes gently turned the pages, his eyes examining the old penmanship with increasing sharpness. It looks to be a journal of Silas Milbray, an ancestor from 1769. He writes of visions, of voices from the marshes, and of candles lit to cement a contract of silence. I frowned. Madness, possibly. Or guilt. Listen. First the tongue, then the breath, then the hand. The flames took their turn, and I was spared. Holmes looked up. Watson believed that each candle represented a form of sacrifice or silencing. The mouth for communication, the breath for life, and the hand for agency. It's a sign, but someone is repeating it with terrifying accuracy. Miss Carroway hovered at the door, her arms clasped tightly. I've never read that far. I didn't know. Holmes closed the book carefully. The vigil was more than just a story. It was a way to bury something. And now it has been disinterred. We returned downstairs with the journal carefully covered in a handkerchief. As we approached the corridor leading to Lord Milbray's room, Holmes slowed. The door was slightly ajar. He approached silently and glanced inside. A nurse was changing the linens, her face blank from exhaustion. Lord Milbrae remained unchanged, pale and motionless, but Holmes walked inside and signalled for the nurse to leave for a while. As the door clicked shut, he approached the bedside and held the ancestor's journal up to the lifeless form. "You see, Watson," he grumbled, "the only way to stir a memory is to show it its reflection." Then he leaned in and gently set the antique book on the coverlet. Let us give the unconscious mind a whisper of its past. Nothing occurred. But as we turned to leave, Holmes cast another glance at the windowsill and froze. During our brief absence, someone had placed a folded square of linen there. No one had entered the room except us and the nurse. Nonetheless, the napkin, weighted with a stone, stood out against the glass. We stepped forward, and Holmes unfolded it with gloved fingers. 5 unlit candles. 2 of them are soot-marked. One is now torn down the middle. Holmes' voice sounded like flint striking stone. Someone was just here while we were upstairs. I proceeded down the hallway, my eyes searching, but the corridor was empty. Holmes inspected the sill. "Dust is displaced, only minutes ago. This message was not placed by accident. It was intended to be discovered before the next." "What does the tear mean?" I asked. "This is a warning or a punishment. The second act is completed, and the third begins. But the nature of it is destruction, not simply marking. Whoever orchestrated this is no longer satisfied with subtlety. They are escalating." A wail resonated from the lower hall just then. Lavington's voice is piercing and incredulous. We dashed down to find him outside the drawing room, gesticulating madly at the glass doors that opened to the south terrace. "She's gone," he replied. "Miss Carroway. I just saw her through the window walking into the fog." She was barefoot. Holmes surged by us, flinging wide the terrace doors. The fields stretched ahead, enveloped by mist, but faint prints disfigured the frost-dusted grass, bare feet moving rapidly and purposefully. Holmes followed them without hesitation, and we pursued them, winding through the stone path until we reached the maze's border. Another napkin was found near the entryway. 4 candles. 3 were marked. Holmes looked at it and then at the ground. "Watson," he insisted, "this is no longer mimicking. This is an abduction disguised as a ritual. She is the next." We ventured inside the maze, following the trail via its meandering living passageways. The hedges stood taller here, and the air was thicker with dampness. At each fork, Holmes knelt and checked the ground, selecting directions with unsettling certainty. We finally discovered her in the center glade. Miss Carroway stood immobile in her nightgown, her hair falling down her shoulders and her face limp as if in a daze. At her feet was a broken candle, blue wax crushed under her heel. Holmes shifted to her side. "Miss Carroway," he called softly, "it is over. You're safe now." She blinked once, slowly, like if emerging from deep water. "I didn't want to go," she muttered. I heard a voice calling from the trees. It said, "One more, Edith. One more to complete the third." "Did you see anyone?" I asked gently. "No, it's just the voice." And then, silence. Holmes guided her back through the maze with cautious calmness. As we approached the terrace, he turned to me and remarked, "It has started to fracture, Watson. Their power is waning. Voices emerge from nowhere, and symbols turn into action. The script is unraveling. This tells us one thing." "What?" "That the author is no longer content to observe." He stopped, his tone low and harsh. "They are stepping onto the stage." Miss Carroway's condition was delicate. Holmes requested she be carried to her chambers and kept under close surveillance, with only Lavington and a maid he trusted allowed to attend to her. Holmes stayed on the terrace for some minutes after our return, his gaze probing the fog that still clung to the grounds, as if it would part to reveal the author of the developing scenario. The wind had altered slightly, bringing with it a weird quiet that pressed against the windows and appeared to muffle the air inside the home. When he finally returned home, Holmes removed his gloves with great slowness and proceeded straight to the study, closing the door behind us. "We now have 4 marked," he added, spreading out the napkins on the table. "Lord Milbrae, Mrs. Fenwick, the burning candle in the maze, and now Miss Carroway. But I believe we misunderstood one important point." I stood by, still recovering my breath after the chase. "What's that?" He tapped the final napkin. The marked candles aren't always victims in the usual sense. Each signifies a transition, an action. The first candle burned without a person or a name. It was symbolic. The second was Lord Milbray's downfall. The third is Fenwick's disappearance. The fourth scene depicts Edith's trance and attempted escape. However, they have not yet suffered any significant injury. They have been hushed, immobilized, and disoriented, but not eliminated. Then what's the endgame? Holmes's eyes gleamed sharply as he stared at me. To isolate. To deplete the house of will, tier by tier. Each step eliminates a layer of resistance. Watson, this is not a random haunting. It is a control system. He took the ancestors' journal from the drawer again. Silas Milbray discussed a lineage pact. He called them the 7 Flames of Penance. But the book never explained what happened when all 7 were ignited, only that it meant the secret was buried in bloodless silence for a generation. Frowned. So the goal is not to die. It is erasure. Precisely. Someone wants to erase something from living memory, and they're doing it by deactivating memory itself. Holmes stood. There is one individual we have overlooked. The nurse. From Lord Milbray's room? Yes. She was present when the last napkin appeared. No one else could have walked in unannounced. And she has been practically invisible during all of this. Come. We discovered her in the East Wing corridor, softly folding linens in the servants' closet. Her name, as previously said, was Mary Coyle, a calm woman of around 30, with ordinary features and a flat voice with little intonation. She did not flinch when Holmes shouted her name or asked her to speak with us discreetly in the dining room. She followed without resistance, her hands lightly coated with starch. "Miss Coyle," Holmes asked as we were seated, "how long have you served the Milbrays?" "Since last autumn, sir. 11 months were you recommended." "Yes, through Dr. Ramsay. He wrote the letter." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "And before that?" "I was in Summerby Asylum. As an attendant." He gave a slight nod, and I could see the wheels in his mind turning. "Did you care for any patients who were in a fugue state? Sudden personality shifts, loss of time?" Her eyes fluttered briefly, but it was the first real emotion she had betrayed. "Yes," she answered. "Several." "Were any suggestible?" A pause. "Yes." Holmes touched the table, once with his fingertip. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Lord Milbray's behavior during your service here, or at Miss Carroway's?" "I don't pry into the family's affairs." "That is not what I asked." She took a direct glance at him. "Lord Milbray would sometimes wander at night, downstairs, always go to the library. He didn't recall it the next morning." Holmes folded his arms. "And you never told anyone?" "There was nothing to tell. He never hurt himself. He never spoke. Just walked." "Did he ever say a name? In his sleep?" "A phrase?" She paused and then said, "Once. He said, 'Ignis Quarta.' I didn't understand it." Holmes arose abruptly. "Thank you, Miss Coyle. You've been quite helpful." When she left the room, he immediately turned to face me. "Ignis Quadrata, the 4th flame. He spoke it before it happened. That means Watson is not just a victim. He is part of the sequence. A vessel for it. You think he's being used?" "Yes." "And I believe that use began a long time ago. Maybe with the cake." I stared at him. "Drugged?" "No. Programmed. Something planted, not physically but mentally, triggered by suggestion, by symbol, by presence. A voice from the forest, a pattern on linen. It sounds silly, but you saw Edith. You witnessed her trance." I nodded slowly. "Then someone, whoever's behind this, must have planted that conditioning." "Precisely. It would also require opportunity, family knowledge, and enough time to establish trust. That limits our suspects." I said the name before he did. "Dr. Ramsay." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "A man who has had years to develop familiarity with the estate, access to medical knowledge, and the authority to recommend staff such as Miss Coyle. And he was there when the first napkin arrived. We need to confront him. Not yet. First, we must draw him out. and see what he does after the sixth light burns. A knock interrupted us. It was Lavington again. His face was ashen. "There's something you need to see," he told you. "In the library." We followed him down the passage to the large double-doored chamber loaded with shelves from floor to ceiling. The hearth shone low at the other end of the room, and another napkin was neatly laying on the fireplace grate next to it. This one had only 2 unlabeled candles. Holmes looked at it for a long time. "2 left," I muttered. "But the 6th hasn't been marked." "No," Holmes said, "it did. This is the 6th, however. The message has changed." He took it up gently. The bottom had a single line written in weak charcoal script. "The flame is now within." Holmes paled. "Watson, we must get to Edith." We rushed to her chambers. The door was ajar. Inside, the maid lay unconscious next to the bed, and the bed was empty. Miss Carroway was gone. The 6th act had begun. Holmes moved faster than I could collect, my breath rushing down the corridor with such ferocity that even Lavington, who was behind us, fell silent. We hurried down the main stairs as Holmes delivered clear instructions. "Seal all exterior doors. Station 1 footman near the servants' exit and another in the kitchen. Nobody leaves this house without my knowledge." Lavington nodded and departed, his footsteps echoing behind us like a ticking clock. The air in the manor had become dense again, pressured and eager. A stillness descended, as if the house itself was holding its breath while waiting for the 7th candle. We proceeded to the study, where Holmes took the ledger from the well-house crate and reopened it to the final pages. He brushed his fingertips over the final 3 Latin phrases with eager regard before flipping back 2 more leaves. "There," he replied softly. "Ignis sexta, intra corpus, flamma vivae, the 6th fire. Inside the body, the flame lives." Watson, this was never simply a countdown. It was an initiation. I felt a chill even before I understood what it meant. They have picked her, Edith, as a vessel. Yes, the narrative must be finished. 7 flames will erase the past. But the 6th must carry it forward. The pattern calls for both elimination and rebirth. In her, the legend doesn't end. It continues. She becomes both the memory and the erasure. We rushed quickly to Lord Milbray's chambers. It was just as we had left it, unchanged and untouched. However, Holmes now evaluated it for intention rather than intrusion. He returned to the windows, this time noticing a faint trace of moisture where a hand had pressed the glass. "She came. Here," he mumbled. To him. Possibly even before she disappeared. The 6th flame, the vital flame, must return to its source, to the person who carried the pact initially. "You mean the ritual requires a witness?" "No. A transference." We descended to the cellar, past the servant quarters, and into the oldest portion of the house, where ancient brickwork gave place to stone foundations, and the mortar between walls began to crack from centuries of use. The air became colder, and the lantern Holmes carried cast lengthy shadows that danced like creatures from lost fables. At the end of the hallway, we discovered the room. It was circular and domed, with soot-darkened brickwork. Shelves built into the stone walls contained empty candle stubs and crumbled parchment. A piece of slate stood in the center, fixed on a granite base. It had the shape of a circle, etched shallow and worn, with 7 spokes radiating outward like the sun. Edith Carroway was at the head of the slate, sitting peacefully on a low wooden stool. Her stance was still, her eyes closed. Her lap had the ancestor's journal, which was now open to the final page. Holmes lifted a hand, instructing me not to talk. He approached cautiously and paused at the circle's perimeter. "Miss Carroway," he said gently, "you're not alone. Whatever you've been assigned to carry does not belong to you." Her eyes opened. There was something in them, remote but aware. She didn't seem startled to see us. "I saw him," she replied softly. "Silas. As a child, I saw him standing in the hedge. I believed he was only a shadow, but I remembered him last night. It was a dream. And then I noticed the book in my hand and the candle in my chest." Holmes knelt beside her, his voice low, hand steady. "What did he say to you, Edith?" "That it wasn't my burden, but it was my name." She touched the page. "The mother's name was Carroway. Silas's child, hidden to avoid a controversy. We aren't just distant relatives. I am his only living descendant. Holmes took a breath, and someone knew that. She nodded. Ramsay. When Holmes heard the name, he stood up as if jerked by an unseen cable. So he is the one who started the first fire. Not in the cake, but in your mind. I remember him visiting when I was a girl, she told me. He told my uncle that I suffered from night terrors, that I was vulnerable and inventive. But I do remember the patterns he drew, circles, flames. The eye. Holmes turned to face me, expression grim. We must find Ramsay. Now. We bolted up the cellar steps, along the corridor, and into the main wing. The halls were empty, the staff had been sent to their posts, and the house was holding its own vigil. We burst into the doctor's room, empty. The windows were open, and the fire was cold. But on the desk was a folded sheet of parchment, its surface bearing a crude version of the candle symbol. Only one candle unmarked, the seventh. There was a signature at the bottom in trembling hand. Ignis Septimus, Oculum Clausum, the seventh flame. The eye is closed. Holmes looked at it for a long time, then he spun on his heel. To the library. We arrived to find Lavington there already, arms folded tightly across his chest. I heard something, he said. Books falling, then nothing. Holmes moved swiftly to the west alcove, where the shelves bent inward to frame a narrow reading nook. Several volumes had indeed fallen, some torn, one split clean in half, but it was what lay atop the pile that froze us all. A candlestick, silver, still warm at the base. Holmes crouched and lifted a book that had fallen last, its spine cracked, pages fanned outward. Tucked between its leaves was a torn corner of a napkin. The edge still smoldered faintly. Ramsay was here, Holmes said. He meant to finish it here. But where is he now? I asked. Holmes stood, and for the first time since the beginning of the case, I saw true alarm in his eyes. He's gone to the chapel. We followed him down the back stairwell, through the stone passage behind the kitchen, and out across the gravel path toward the chapel that stood near the edge of the Milbrae estate, unused in decades, but still maintained, out of tradition, if not faith. The door was ajar. We entered. Ramsay stood before the altar, his back to us. A ring of 7 candles burned around him, one extinguished. 6 flickering wildly in the draught. Holmes stepped into the circle. No further, Doctor. The performance ends now. Ramsay turned. His face was pale, his eyes glassy and strange. In one hand he held the final napkin, in the other, a vial of clear liquid. I waited too long, he said. Silas failed to finish it. I only meant to correct the omission. She is the end. She is the vessel. Holmes stepped closer, careful not to enter the circle of flame. You used her, built the narrative in her mind with symbols, patterns, suggestion, but your method relied on belief, and she no longer believes in you. From behind us, Edith's voice was calm and clear. No, I don't, Ramsay faltered. She stepped into the chapel alone. Her hair pulled back, her eyes focused and unafraid. You planted it, she said, but I refused it. You used my mind, but not my will. Ramsay let out a low sound, somewhere between despair and awe. I needed the 7th, he whispered. To end it, Holmes stepped forward. You were the 7th, Ramsay. You lit every fire, you extinguished every will, and now you complete the circle. Before Ramsay could reply, Holmes moved with startling speed, knocking the vial from his hand. It shattered on the stone floor, the liquid hissing faintly as it sank into the cracks. The candles flickered and died. Ramsay fell to his knees. Holmes turned to Edith. It's over, she nodded, voice steady. No, it's remembered. Holmes remained motionless for a moment beside the shattered vial, his silhouette tall against the chapel's dim grey light. Ramsay knelt in the center of the extinguished ring, shoulders trembling, not with grief or guilt, but something closer to disbelief, as though his own story had misfired in its final paragraph. The air inside the chapel had changed. The weight that had pressed down on all of us since the arrival of that first cake now seemed to lift, not vanish entirely, but shift, as though no longer centered in this man or this space. Edith stood with her back straight, chin lifted. There was no trace now of the dreamy lassitude that had overtaken her in the maze, or the blank stillness she'd worn in the slate room below the manor. Her eyes were focused, unwavering. She crossed the stone floor slowly, stopping just at the broken edge of the circle. Holmes stepped aside without a word, letting her take his place. "You gave me the legend," she said quietly, looking down. "At Ramsay. You planted it in my dreams, my childhood, my bloodline. You wrapped it in symbols and called it history, but it wasn't yours to finish." Ramsay looked up, his visage deteriorating into something sad and insignificant. "I was trying to preserve it, to finish what Silas started. He lacked conviction. I examined his journals, traced the genealogy, and chose the time. I arranged the cake and napkins. I even modernized the old traditions using psychological triggers and ingrained hints. She was destined to become the flame, the vessel that completes the vigil and locks the past." Holmes stepped forward, his voice quiet but forceful. "What you attempted to seal was not history, it was your own preoccupation. The flames, the countdown, the legend, they were never predetermined. They were in the theater. You were not carrying out Silas Milbray's ceremonies. You were writing your own under the guise of an ancient narrative." Ramsay blinked slowly, hollow. "But I never hurt them, I just rearranged, induced a suggestion." "They were never in danger." Holmes studied him with a curious mix of disgust and icy pity. "You term it a recommendation. I call it a siege, a creeping dismemberment of the will, carried out in such gentle increments that no one noticed until the air became thick with anxiety. You created a machine of symbols and let it run free. That is harmful, Doctor. And it almost succeeded." Ramsay collapsed to the floor, palms flat against the cold stone. The final napkin dropped from his hand and landed near the dying flame of the last candle. Holmes retrieved and turned it over. There were no marks on the back this time, no soot. "There's no script, just silence." Outside, the wind had died. The fog had started to lift from the grounds. It receded gradually, like a breath dragged back through the woods. We escorted Ramsay back to the manor under protection, while Lavington arranged for the local policeman to be summoned discreetly. Holmes instructed the employees to remain calm and carry on with their work as usual. He insisted that the spell, the aura of fear and expectation, be broken, replaced by ordinary activity, brightness, warmth, and the aroma of baking bread. Later, that afternoon, Holmes and I sat down again in the study. The fire blazed brighter now for comfort rather than resistance. Miss Carroway had joined us, wrapped in a wool shawl, her face composed but tinged with exhaustion. "Lord Milbray has spoken," she informed us quietly. Just a few words, but his eyes remained clear. "He asked that the window be opened." Holmes nodded slowly. "The chain has broken. The final act was interrupted. The idea loses its grip if the ceremony is not completed. That is, if the seventh flame is not lighted in the way Ramsay intended. The others will gradually return to themselves." I glanced to Holmes. "But why this family? Why this legend?" He opened the ancestor's journal and turned to a passage he had marked. Silas Milbray was a scared guy. He imagined he could bury his remorse in ritual, obliterate a child's existence with ceremony. He documented each symbolic deed, not to sanctify, but to forget. Ramsay discovered his works and understood them as theology, but they were just pieces of a man unraveling. Edith leaned forwards, her voice calm. "And yet I was raised in its shadow. In the same house, they have the same blood. I assumed the fear was mine, but it wasn't. It was inherited." "Exactly," Holmes responded. "Ramsay never realized that symbols alone have no force. Belief, repetition, animates them. You broke the pattern not by opposing it, but by memorizing everything. You brought it into the open." We sat in silence for a while, each buried in meditation. Outside, the sun was breaking through the frost-glazed windows, casting streaks of light across them. The house seemed to breathe again. Edith turned to face Holmes. "So it's over?" He did not respond immediately. Instead, he rose and took 7 napkins from the side cupboard. He placed them out on the table one by one in their proper order. 6 are marked, one untouched. The seventh, Ramsay's, was never completed. He then placed a final item in the center of the arrangement, the torn page from the ancestor's journal, with the etched circle and the phrase oculum clausum. "I would say," Holmes remarked softly, "the legend is over, but the recollection has only begun. Miss Carroway, the house has been wounded. However, wounds do not terminate a narrative. They begin the healing of it." She looked at him with something resembling gratitude, but not just thanks. It was the kind of look one gives to someone who has seen too much but still chooses to stay. That night, after Edith had retired, Holmes and I went for a final walk around the manor grounds. For the first time in days, the stars shone brightly above the trees. The maze remained silent in the distance, its hedges shining faintly with frost. Holmes lighted his pipe and gazed out across the garden. "There is something extremely disturbing," he added, "about being accepted into a narrative that one does not create. The majority of situations are puzzles. This was a performance, and I fear we stepped onto the stage just as the curtain was about to fall." I considered that in silence. "But you stopped it." "No," he replied gently. "Yes, she did. I just helped her read the script." We returned indoors. Holmes halted at the study door, his hand on the doorknob. "Watson," he replied, "there is an ancient comfort in logic, but every now and then we bump up against the boundary of what logic cannot truly explain, only contain." This was such a situation. He opened the door. The fire had died down again, spreading long shadows across the napkins on the desk. He closed the door behind us, and neither of us turned back. Morning brought a thin mist that clung to the trees, like a memory, refusing to lift even as the first sunlight streamed over the hedgerows and onto the frost-covered grounds of Millbrae Manor. Inside, the house slowly came back to life. The air, while still tinged with caution, no longer carried the dense quiet of dread. Holmes stood at the parlor window, his arms folded behind him, watching the earth's languid breath continue its beat. I joined him without saying anything, both of us gazing at the distant chapel roof visible through the hedges. "There's something that still doesn't sit right," I whispered gently, barely audible over the tick of the mantel clock. Holmes did not glance at me. "Yes, and it's been on the edge of my mind all morning." We'd spent the better part of the previous 2 days unraveling a performance, a ritual constructed from forgotten guilt and weaponized memory. Ramsay was now in custody, taken discreetly under the guise of a medical transfer, his mind dissolving without the structure of his hallucination to guide him. Edith had escaped from her adventure, startled but unharmed. Lord Millbrae, though still weak, had begun to speak in complete sentences. Nonetheless, Holmes's restlessness persisted, not the usual flashes of thought before deduction, but a stillness that often indicated that something had been overlooked. "What is it?" I inquired. He finally turned from the window. "The ledger. The one from the well." "No. The other. The estate. Ledger in the tower. I'd like to review the entries from the last few months, especially those written by Lavington." I was taken by surprise. "You suspect him?" "I suspect opportunity," Holmes said, "and too many convenient absences." We returned to the tower room. The air was dry and cold, unchanged since our last visit. Holmes opened the cabinet labeled Current Estate Affairs and removed the thickest volume. The most recent entries were written by Lavington in a neat, controlled style. Holmes flipped back a dozen pages before moving forward again, his eyes skimming. Then he paused. "This line," he muttered. "Special expenditure. Delivery. External supplier. September 14th. Paid. With cash. There's no description." "No initials." I leaned in. "Could be anything." Holmes closed the book carefully. "I'm not concerned about the payment. It is the date. That's exactly 1 week before the cake appeared." He retrieved his notebook and quickly cross-referenced the napkin's known appearances. The pattern holds. Each symbolic element was preceded by silence, delivery, and emergence. Ramsay may have planned the ritual, but someone inside the house moved the pieces. You think Lavington placed the cake. I think Ramsay could not have. He needed proximity, but not exposure. He required someone invisible to the family, trusted but overlooked. The steward fits. We descended quickly, and Holmes asked for Lavington to be summoned to the study. He arrived moments later, visibly tired, his coat faintly dusted with ash from the morning fire. Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Lavington, we owe you thanks for your cooperation throughout this difficult investigation, but I must ask for your patience with one final matter." "Of course," Lavington said, though there was something guarded in the set of his mouth. Holmes held up the ledger. "This entry on the 14th of September, what was delivered?" Lavington looked at the book, then back at Holmes. "A parcel from the city. Ramsay arranged it. I paid the courier. What was in it?" "I wasn't told. The doctor said it was personal." "And the cake?" Holmes asked calmly. "The napkin?" Lavington's composure held for a second longer, just long enough to suggest rehearsed indifference. Then something flickered. A sliver of uncertainty, of exposure. Holmes leaned forward. "You placed it on the doorstep after dark. You followed Ramsay's instructions because he promised you a place in the new order, didn't he?" Lavington rose. "This is absurd." "I've been serving this house for 20 years. "Yes," Holmes responded without moving. "And that loyalty left you exposed. You didn't mean to hurt Lord Milbrae. You thought you were assisting him in fulfilling a destiny, a family reckoning Ramsay had convinced you needed to be accomplished. He turned your sense of responsibility against you." Lavington paused. "He told me it was about balance, that Lord Milbrae had kept a secret for too long. It would devastate the estate if left unsolved." "So you placed the cake," Holmes remarked. "You left the napkins by the window, the maze, and the well house. You didn't grasp everything, but you trusted Ramsay's intentions." Lavington's voice was suddenly tiny. "He showed me the journals. He said Edith needed to see them, that she needed to recall. And now?" Lavington gazed down. "I think I helped him break her instead." Holmes stood. "No, you did not." "Because," she remembered, and decided to end it. "We asked that he stay in his quarters until the authorities arrived." He did not argue. That evening, Edith joined us in the drawing room for tea. She sat by the window, the fire providing a gentle warmth to her face. Holmes stood at the hearth, a pipe unlit between his fingers. "He confessed," I told her. "Lavington." She did not react angrily, merely with a long, languid blink. "He was always nice to me. However, this is overly kind, as if they already knew something they shouldn't." "You were the final piece," Holmes replied softly. "But you were never his to place." She looked at him, and her expression was clear, not relief but resolution. "I'll stay," she replied. "Here, I mean. With my uncle healing, the house requires assistance, not just manage it, but also watch it, to ensure that it never becomes that place again." Holmes tilted his head. "That would be wise." Outside, the moon rose clear and silver behind the trees, no longer obscured by mist. The garden walks were visible again, as was the old well house, its roof glinting faintly with frost. As we stood, I turned to face Holmes. "Will you ever explain how you knew Ramsay was the author of it all?" He gave me a sidelong look. "Watson, this is a simple matter. The mind leaves fingerprints just as surely as the hand does. Ramsay was the only one in this home who asked the appropriate questions just a little too late. We left the manor at first light. Edith led us to the carriage, her shawl snugly wrapped around her shoulders. There were no lingering words, no overplayed farewells. Only the quiet realization that everything had come to an end, and that something new, perhaps better, had begun. As the carriage moved away from the manor gates, I took a quick look back. The morning sun reflected on the top windows of the west tower, causing them to shine brightly, and for the first time since our arrival, the house appeared to be awake. Our train back to London left the station just as the sun crested the low horizon of the northern hills, throwing long bronze ribbons across the fields. Holmes had taken his seat with an unopened newspaper in his lap, his gaze fixed on the window glass, though I suspected he wasn't looking at the scenery at all. I paused for a moment before saying, "It was more than a case, wasn't it?" He did not turn away from the window. "Yes, Watson, it was. I waited, but he provided nothing more, so I tried again. You've faced killers, blackmailers, conspirators of the highest order, and yet I've seldom seen you so rattled." He let out a gentle gasp of amusement. I'm not rattled, grounded. There is a distinction. By what? By something rarely present. In our inquiry's legacy. Not in the sense of heritage, blood or title, but in the silent corrosive power of a story believed too long and investigated too little. He finally looked at me, and his gaze lacked his typical dominance. The vigil of the seven flames was never real, not in the supernatural sense. There were no demons in the well house and no spirits in the hedgerows. However, belief made it real enough, and Watson, belief can be even more deadly than craziness. I nodded slowly. Ramsay believed it. To the point of transforming the world around us. He created a scaffolding of suggestion, symbols, sleepwalks, whispered legends, and fed it to individuals who were most susceptible to implication. Edith, Lavington, and Lord Milbray. Each carried a piece of the story, planted deep and left to grow unchecked. It was not a cult in the traditional sense. It was a lone priest manipulating a quiet congregation. And yet, I replied, it was Edith who undid it. Holmes grinned slightly. That's what makes this instance special. Typically, I use logic to draw out a killer or proof to bait a fraudster. Edith Carraway, however, broke the grip by rejecting a lie rather than seeking the truth. She saw through the ceremony, not because she believed it wasn't real, but because she refused to let it define her. We rode in silence for a few more moments, the countryside passing by like a theatre curtain, unfurling after the final act. Holmes eventually unfurled his newspaper and began leafing through it absently. But I knew his thoughts were still in that church with the dispersed candles. Later that evening, when we returned to Baker Street, Holmes retreated to his chair beside the hearth while I straightened my travel notes and attempted to tie off loose ends in the case. I expected him to mention Silas Milbray or Ramsay, or the frightening accuracy of the countdown, but he said nothing until Mrs. Hudson brought in a tray of tea, along with a small white letter written to Holmes in an elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. He opened it with a thin ivory-handled knife and read quietly. Then he handed it to me. It was from Edith, Mr. Holmes. I'm writing to thank you not just for what you did to protect the truth about my family, but also for what you left unsaid. I've subsequently gone through every ledger, letter, and page in Silas Milbray's journal. I now realize that he was not a mystic, but a guy tormented by remorse. He chose mythology over confession. In doing so, he instilled fear in all who followed. Disguised as fate, I fired all servants connected to Ramsay's network, including Miss Coyle. Lord Milbray has appointed me legal steward of the estate while he recovers. I aim to keep the manor intact, not as a shrine, but as a place where no more stories will be spoken behind curtains. I've also locked up the napkins, not destroyed, rather locked away. Because forgetting is not a remedy for a wound, but perhaps containment is. Please know that you are welcome here at any time, with no pretense other than to rest. With respect, Edith Carraway. Holmes returned the letter to its envelope, then stood and moved to the mantel, reaching for his pipe, but pausing. I'd like to visit that library again someday, he remarked gently. Without a mystery breathing down our necks, I smiled. Perhaps you might yet find time for leisure. Unlikely, he remarked, not meanly, but possible. He lighted the pipe then, sending tendrils of smoke curling into the air. I leaned back and folded my hands in my lap. You know, I said, in most cases you solve the problem, identify the villain, and then move on. But this one feels different. It was, he answered, because it wasn't a question of crime but of story. Ramsay did not murder anyone, directly. He did no forgery or fraud in the legal sense. Nonetheless, he nearly obliterated a woman's identity, shattered a family's history, and transformed a legend into a weapon. That is a rarer type of villainy. Will he be charged? Most likely committed. As far as I could tell, his sanity had always been dependent on the ritual's survival. When Edith shattered it, he started to fracture. Holmes turned towards the fire. But it is not him I find myself thinking of now. No? No, he replied. I think of Silas Milbray, and how his fear of exposure drove him to create a story so detailed that even he came to believe it. That is the real threat, Watson. Not lies told to others, but those told to oneself until they harden into doctrine. The clock chimed softly behind us. Outside, the wind swept against the windows with the faint hiss of autumn. Holmes looked up abruptly. "You never asked about—" "The cake," I blinked. "The cake?" "The original delivery. The start of it all. I assumed it was Ramsay's idea. Symbolic, unsettling." Holmes nodded. "It was. But the contents of the cake were unremarkable. There's no poison, no compound. But the box in which it arrived, that was another story. Double-walled. Inside the liner, beneath the cake board, were 4 strips of paper covered in a belladonna-derived resin, subtle enough not to kill, but enough to cause a vulnerable person to faint, hallucinate, or experience spells of confusion if exposed for several hours. So Lord Milbrae, he was never drugged during his meals. He was placed near the box for only long enough to have an episode. A skillfully planned fall serves to maintain the illusion. Ramsay had complete control of all variables." I exhaled. "And we walked into it on the very edge of the 6th candle." "Quite so," Holmes replied, "but it will not be repeated." He drew again on his pipe. "And so, Watson, we discover that not all crimes include blood and larceny. Some consist of fear and repetition. It was not a murder mystery, it was a war over memory." I closed my journal. "No one died," I said. Holmes nodded once. "But someone lived." He made no response to that, only sat with his pipe and his stillness as the fire burned steadily behind him and the world outside our windows returned to its normal pace. And far to the north, in a mansion once constructed to enshrine a secret, a woman sat alone, unafraid. The candles dimmed and her own story began. The next week passed in a slow and steady return to normalcy, as if the events at Milbrae Manor had occurred in some foggy corner of the past. Nevertheless, they lingered longer than most. Holmes did not discuss the case in the days that followed, but I frequently saw him seated at his desk, his pipe cold, and a blank sheet before him that remained unsigned. He wasn't brooding or restless, just still, as if the mind that usually soared ahead of the world had paused for a moment to listen to its echoes. Then one evening, as the rain fell gently against the windows and the fire cast warm gold across our shared living room, he broke his stillness. "There is a detail," he explained, "that I did not discuss with the policeman, nor till now with you." I glanced up from my medical journal. "Go on." Holmes took out a little folded paper from his breast pocket, yellowed at the edges and embossed, with the same symbol we'd grown accustomed to, the eye surrounded by 7 flames. But this version was older, stitched by hand with a tighter thread, and the linen was somewhat torn. "This," he added, laying it flat, "is not from the well-housed container or in Ramsay's custody. I discovered it in the lining of Lord Milbrae's writing desk stuck behind a false panel. It precedes Ramsay, it even predates Silas. The thread and weave go back to 1730. I sat forward. "Then the legend was older than Silas Milbrae." Holmes nodded. "I think that was his worry, that what he had merely copied was in reality correct, that he inherited more than simply guilt, obligation, and in striving to delete it, he simply added to the narrative. Ramsay just seized on what had already begun to ferment. He leaned back and steepled his fingers. The final deception was neither Ramsay's bogus prophecy nor Lavington's covert involvement. It was the assumption that the vigil had a beginning or an end. It never did. It was always a spiral, a plot designed to repeat itself via dread, secrecy, and ritual. I looked down at my napkin. "And you chose not to tell the constable?" "What would they charge it with? It's not a crime to have an old cloth, Watson. There is no point in reigniting a fear that has already been extinguished. Edith Carroway understands that better than anyone." We were quiet for a moment. Then I asked, "Do you truly believe it's over?" He gave a rare, faint but sincere smile. "As conclusive as any ghost story could be. As long as no one listens for footsteps in the maze or waits for the candles to light themselves, the story will sleep. So do its authors." He tapped ash into the tray and stood, walked to the bookcase, and sliding the napkin into a slim folio, next to our case notes. "And should it wake again," he added, "we'll be listening." Mrs. Hudson knocked on the door, carrying 2 letters and a tray of supper. Holmes opened one envelope with his long knife and scanned its contents. Her solicitor in Truro has requested consultation on a matter involving forged wills and a missing postman, he explained, delivering the letter to me. It seems the world, ever obliging, continues to produce puzzles. He grabbed for his coat and hat, but hesitated at the entrance to peek back toward the hearth. And yet I think we shall remember this one, Watson, not for its difficulty, but for its shape. What shape is that? I inquired. He grinned slightly. A circle, naturally. We strolled outside into the night, the gas lamps shining in the foggy London darkness, the sound of rain softly hitting the cobblestones, and someplace far away behind locked doors and extinguished candles, a home looked over itself silently, not haunted, not cursed, just awake and still.